Just a quick intro of who I am. So I very recently joined Sitecore. I was formerly at one of the partners, Valtech, for many years, where I ran a practice focusing on data and analytics. So I'm happy to be in a new phase of my career now. Happy to join Sitecore. And I was also an MVP for a few years as well. So that's a little bit about me. I'll start with a meme. I wanted to talk about building a business case for machine learning pilots. I know a lot of people are really interested in this field. And about 3 years ago, for those of you that know, I ran a small pilot with one of my customers in Toronto and learned a lot in the process. And since then, since 2016, a lot of things have changed for 2019. And there's a lot of things I would probably raise or question if I was trying to pitch that story again. So I really wanted to give the community the benefit of some of those thoughts and just continue to encourage everyone to build creative and innovative solutions on the platform. So raise your hand if you've built a machine learning pilot. Awesome. Have you researched machine learning? Know a little bit about it? Okay, cool. Keep on keeping on. So I have 3 parts. So I wanted to just start with talking about, what questions are we facing in 2019 when we want to do this? And I'll preface this by saying I'm not going to get deep into, the technical details of a pilot, but I will give you something at the end to go and look at in case you would like more details. The first thing to say is artificial intelligence, AI, is not the same thing as machine learning. It's a superset, I would say, although I am guilty of mixing in the two a little bit in my presentation. Machine learning tends to be described as a subset of AI, and specifically, the definition that I like to use is that it lets us replace human judgment with prediction using statistical methods. Typically, when you have a really big data set, it's good at doing fuzzier stuff that takes us a long time. So the 2 typical use cases tend to be either replacing those tedious processes with prediction or pattern recognition. So again, really good for when a little bit of fuzziness is a decent trade-off for time spent. And then a second use case of discovering new patterns and groupings that we didn't know existed, which is an example might be a cluster of behavior in clickstream data. So what is still true since maybe a few years ago? It's definitely still hard to pitch any sort of project with unknown outcomes. Data cleansing is probably one of the key problems we all have in terms of just getting a really nice rectangular data set to play with. There's still a lot of hype, and it can be hard to define a business story amidst all of the hype. And of course, the industry and the tech stacks are increasingly fragmented. In MarTech, the industry where we all work, every year that diagram comes out and it's just, thousands and tens of thousands, et cetera. So it can be really overwhelming. Now, granted, this is from 2017, but I don't actually think it's changed that much. If you ask the question what barriers are faced at work by data scientists or anyone working in that field, it's dirty data, its lack of support, et cetera. This is a survey done by Kaggle.com, who were later purchased by Google. And if you're curious, they do a series of competitions, and they actually get some really nice big consumer brands to donate data sets, and you can run some experiments on that data and compete. So for example, Home Depot, I think, gave them a huge chunk of purchase data that you could play with. So if you're interested, check out Kaggle. So then 3 things I want to point out that have evolved to close out this part. So an explosion of services and platforms. So in 2016, we had a lot of machine learning and AI platforms available to us. In 2019, we have even more. And the pricing is coming down, and the accessibility and the ease of use is going up. Everyone wants that story of democratizing machine learning for everybody to reach a wider audience. So that's really changed. Gartner released a forecast where they actually said that the business value derived from AI is actually going to be represented by customer experience as the majority. So followed by new revenue streams through 2025. So, That's our field of digital experience is absolutely a subset of customer experience. So that's kind of huge, right? So this field is really going to make a big impact. And then finally, trust. We heard a little bit about this on Wednesday. Trust being a competitive advantage increasingly, care of data, privacy concerns, et cetera. This was certainly around before, but given recent events, it's certainly, I think, on the radar a lot more than it used to be. So I would say, for me, those are the three trends that kind of frame the context right now. There's many more, but those would be the three I would mention. So I wanted to share with you a few highlighted places that are really tangible. So if you've got a Sitecore instance, whether on 8 or 9, you could use any version. You've got a Sitecore instance, you've probably got a digital experience being published, maybe some data is collecting. Where is the easiest place to start if you want to have a look? So I pulled this, I don't know if that's readable, I'm sorry, but it's from a Forrester paper called Artificial Intelligence Will Spark a Real Marketing Renaissance. So what they've done is they've plotted maturity and maturity at the bottom to emerging, and then present day into the future. So you can see where various things are plotting. So things in the bottom left are generally more available and mature now, and then everything in the top right is a little more emerging. So I would say that's a superset for artificial intelligence. But I actually wanted to break down 4 easy places to start amongst that, where I'm seeing the most common use cases. And they spread across 2 journeys that we're all very familiar with. So customer experience being one of them, so the public facing of your Sitecore implementation, and then the authoring experience and the marketer experience. So first and foremost, recommenders. We saw a few presentations at this conference that were calling out to recommender services. This is the common logic where users similar to you bought X. And this can be really helpful in any sort of purchase funnel where you want to upsell or cross-sell, make any sort of suggestion, and then you can measure the impact of doing this pretty easily. Same with personalization, kind of, did it impact your conversion rate or your engagement levels? And typically the way this is done is there's oodles of services you can call. Pete called out to a movie recommender, for example, or you can train one yourself. The second one under customer experience, I would say, is segmentation. So this is most commonly seen as building some sort of predictive model in a platform and then calling back to Sitecore to update a contact facet or maybe a custom outcome with a value. And that means when that person returns, you can personalize. So maybe you'll do a custom rule in the rules editor, check that field, and then actually do a personalization for them. So that's how the operational flow would go most commonly. So you can do anything from, a propensity score, likelihood to renew, likelihood to do anything really, anything that you can predict using your data set. I've seen some people do some really cool things with, external feeds or membership databases, et cetera. And where this can really help is, of course, more targeted personalization. So you might have some behavioral things to look at to personalize to. And you might have actually explicit fields from your CRM. This kind of takes it to the next level and says, you know what, we also predict that this person is part of a certain group. And we'll suggest something to them based on that. Insight is a big part here too. So insights into your segments, maybe you can understand a little bit more about the people, and understanding what's influencing behavior too can come out of some of those models. So same kind of measurement story there. Is it impacting things like visitor engagement or churn rate? So on the other side of the coin, we have marketing content authoring experience. So a lot of use cases tend to emerge in terms of helpers for just enriching content and getting rid of some processes that used to be manual, like tagging. Image tagging is a classic example. Image recognition, so automated tagging of metadata, topic clustering, things like these are common that you'll see. Shorter time to value for the marketer is really where this adds value. And reduction of heavy lifting. So the typical measurement here would be, right now it takes a marketer 60 minutes to create and deploy a landing page. Really simple. I've seen clients use that. And you can then end up a story where, we cut that in half. It's 30 minutes now because we added some of this in to save time. So typical techniques here, sentiment analysis, semantic analysis, natural language processing, pattern recognition. A lot of these are generally available now in a lot of services. And then finally, helpers for author experience. So this is where we're seeing, bots embedded in the marketer experience, intelligence search, shout out to our friends at Coveo who do a lot in this space, query parsing and results relevance. There's really rich stuff here that you can use to accelerate processes, and it's really about assistance and discovery for people working in a platform. Same type of measurement, time to execute is probably the easiest one to access, and then, this is similar stuff, bots, etc. So to me, and there's many, many use cases, I'm actually going to leave you with a reading list at the end if you want to explore all of this more, but these to me are the most tangible and accessible ones if you want to start with this. So now I want to get a little more tactical and help you understand maybe how you can build a bit of a better story once you've chosen a place to start with. So we have some really nice basic ingredients with Sitecore. If you want, I firmly believe the digital journey is a really, really rich place to do some of this experimentation because you have access to data and you also have full access to the journey, two journeys actually, the digital journey for the end customer as well as the content author journey. So there's so many places and hooks where you can be extremely creative and say, this piece takes a long time. Is there anything we can do creatively to, narrow it? Or equally, is there something we can do to add more insights here to help somebody? So we have that. We have some new technologies such as Cortex. If you went to Jason Wilkerson's presentation, you probably understood a little more about that and the way it's scaling out data processing and the ability to call out to services, machine learning or anything else. Access to the journeys, as I mentioned. Tangible use cases, a lot of literature out there now about specifically for DXP and digital. And everyone here, a very amazing, helpful community that's available to all, which I really want to evangelize to those who might be new to the community. This is great, it's one of the best ones. So planning your pilot, I want to recommend kind of 4 steps that you should take. Normally, when I would talk about a business case, I'd say start with the business problem, but I'm actually going to flip it here if you're talking about a pilot. You're probably going to have an easier time if you start by looking at the data you actually have access to and use that to drive it a bit more, because the point is to prove a thought or a concept as opposed to a full-blown production project. So we're working in a little bit of a test and learn paradigm. So map out what you have. It might be as basic as just an anonymous XDB collecting data. You might also have a CRM. You might have Twitter. You might have a PIM. So there's lots of different things out there that could contribute. And then define the use case or problem you want to solve. And if you've heard me speak before, I always advocate to have a really crisp business statement to surround something. So an example might be, it takes 5 hours to publish a landing page, or our conversion rate is getting lower. Something like that makes it really tangible to then say, we did something and then it improved by X%. Keep it small and contained. I would say, especially if you're starting out, just don't be too ambitious. Find a first proof point as a beachhead and then go from there. And research platforms that provide help. So a lot of the ones that are out there have, they have templates and tutorials and sales engineers. There's so much available to support you. Pre-built pipelines even. It's really, really rich and valuable for you. And the last point I want to make is to close the loop. This is actually something I didn't do. And what I mean by that is, you can build a model out in a separate platform, but it's not really useful unless it writes back to Sitecore so you can do something with the output. So I would say don't widen keep your project small, but make sure you close the loop so that you have kind of the full end-to-end proof point and benefit, and then build your story. So I have a little bit of a model I built, and this is basically based on my learnings and things that I've read. This is how I would look at pitching something in this day and age. So if you look at pilot ingredients, there's kind of a base level. You have Sitecore, assuming you have Sitecore. You have some sort of technology that you're going to work with for machine learning. You have your data that you have to collect. You have permission to use data sources, depending on your context. This might simply be permission from the owners of that data, or it might also be permission of the people inside the data. And then you have your simple benefit statement. So I would say that's table stakes to have as part of your story. And then we can start to layer on some other stuff. So I would say the next level up, sorry about that orange box, would be these 4 things. So I won't go through each of them in detail, but I would say the way to look at this is that you don't need to do all of it, but if you think about what's important to your stakeholders, your managers, your organization, you can kind of pick and choose and say, you know what, I've got a kernel of a really strong technical story, but I'm also going to really push, because our conversion rate dropped and everyone's freaking out, I'm really going to push that angle as well and maybe predict that it will lift. If you're in a regulated industry, you might want to spend more time on showing that you thought about risks and bring that forward as well. Operationalization, that's kind of what I mentioned about closing the loop. And then, responsible AI, I'll touch on that in a minute. If you have a stakeholder who's very responsibility-minded, that could be useful to add to your story. Production readiness and scale. So in a pilot, we don't always think about what this would actually look like in production. You may not need to. You may just really be trying to prove value somewhere. But it might be a case if you have maybe a very complex infrastructure that you want to put some thought into that up front. I won't go through all of these. And then finally, competitive advantage and revenue streams is kind of the icing on top. So if you can make any sort of comment about, you know what, we did something really simple. We saved 30 minutes on some process. But what this means for our organization is much bigger because it gives us some advantage in some other process. So you can think creatively about how to add those kinds of things to your story. So I'm going to take do a special call out for measurement. So this is the point I was making earlier about having that crisp statement. Find a metric. This doesn't have to be a calculated, a complex calculation of ROI. Just take a simple statement like any of these, and then you can actually show the before and after, and that's what gets everyone's attention. So just find something that everyone really cares about or that's really impacting operations. Make a statement like this, and then weave it into your story. And I'll give a special shout out actually to one of our Experience Award winners, the RAC Western Australia and partner Ignia. They have a fantastic story. You can read the case study. But they actually, they trained a recommender that does an upsell and cross-sell at the end of the purchase funnel, and their results were fantastic. So they have great metrics. They had huge uptake in terms of all of the metrics you see there on the left, but they also looked at internal engagement. So the project was so exciting that they actually were able to measure things like team engagement as well at the same time. So the more that you can add metrics like that to the story, the better traction you'll have. And then I'll just close this part with more what I call story strengtheners. So you can help get your data house in order. So you can use your pilot as part of a story of if there's someone who wants to get, what are we doing with our enterprise data? Maybe this is a small example of where, we cleaned up this little bit, we got value from it. Let's try to do that more broadly. I think Paige uses the term make data a team sport, so get more people on your side. Explore further influencing factors. So this is a fun one. If you have a basic data set that you're working with, you can do things like feature engineering or pull in other data sources like social feeds or open data sets. Like municipalities will tend to publish things like the latitude and longitude of all skating rinks. I mean, who knows what you'd do with that, but if it was useful, you could pull it in and supplement your data set with that. Competitive advantage. So you may have some advantage you didn't realize in the data that you collect. You could apply your models in some unique way. You might have unique access to some sort of process, but try to see if you can link the pilot to something bigger like that, and that will definitely I think, strengthen the story. Responsibility-minded stakeholders. So this is a story I like to tell. One of the cool things I think you can do with a pilot is actually think about your normal stakeholders. So think about who would be impacted. Probably your marketing personas who visit the site, maybe your content authors, these are the typical groups. But if you do an exercise where you actually add an unexpected stakeholder, like your city, or a child, even if it seems a little bit silly, it can actually prompt a lot of creative thought. And the classic example, one of our panelists on Wednesday gave this example is, when Airbnb started, the two segments seemed obvious, property owners and renters, but the cities and neighborhoods were actually stakeholders that got hugely impacted that were not necessarily considered maybe at the beginning. Possible risks, so I wanted to touch briefly on risk. Your pilot may be so self-contained that there's not really a huge risk, but again, thinking proactively about this I think can help. So I listed a few examples there, but one example could be, if you're doing an asynchronous job versus an asynchronous model that's updating the contact record might be slightly less risky than a real-time call from a presentation pipeline, for a few reasons. So you kind of get where I'm going with that. So a few examples of thinking through risks. And then expanding your collection window. So when I did my pilot, we collected for 2 months. We collected data over the summer, which may have actually been the worst time because it was about MBA students. But if you think of a business school, there's definitely rhythms of behavior that change all through the year, right? There's school starting, there's when everybody applies and is researching the programs, when school's ending. So if you can find a way to expand your collection window, that will also start enriching and saying, we found this result when we did 2 months of data, then we gathered for 6 months or a year, and we really found these other insights based on that entire pattern of looking the entire time. So, we go back to the use cases that we talked about. You'll see that I added some numbers at the bottom. And what do the numbers mean? Well, I'm actually, I went out and asked everyone, I asked the community, who's done a pilot? And I gathered 12 of them, which I'll share with you here. This is probably very hard to read. But I found this really interesting. What I've done here is I've given a very brief description of the type of solution. So these are real pilots that have been done on Sitecore. Some are on version 8, some are on version 9, and I want to give a nice shout out to the people listed in the contacts who had some really interesting and creative ideas of what to do here. And you'll see that there's an enormous diversity of use cases. So if you're looking for inspiration, look no further than these to have a look. You'll see that the categorizations are kind of 50-50 split across, those two categories. So personalization versus marketer efficiency. So a really nice coverage, I think, of examples. And a really nice diversity of technologies used. So people are playing with a lot of different things, which of course means I've linked to the blog posts on the right-hand side. A lot of these community members have blogged extensively about what they did. So if you really want to understand what's the data set they started with, how did they think through the business problem, what were the very detailed steps they took, then I invite you, this deck will be made available, but I'll invite you to read that, and I'd be surprised if they weren't very open to questions about their work. And I guess I'll just take the opportunity to encourage everyone to do pilots. We have symposium coming up in November, which is always a great place to showcase your work. Even if you just use it as an internal deadline, you can have a look. And also, myself and others on the product team, keeping this kind of inventory is a great way to understand how it's being used, the platform, the types of use cases you're coming up against, et cetera. So if I got anything wrong up here, my apologies. Send me a note and I'll make it right for the deck. If I missed anyone's project, it was not intentional. I'd love to add it. So again, send me a note. But I think we can really have a nice collection to pull from. And I'll encourage everyone to keep blogging and sharing what they're doing for everyone's benefit. And I will close with a reading list for you. So these are some articles I especially appreciate, and if you're looking to research further into business value, how AI is predicted to, change the world, change the marketing world, etc. And a few people at the bottom there, if you're interested in things like privacy and responsible AI and such, people to follow on Twitter, I certainly do, and there's some great writing being done about those types of topics. So, thank you.
We have some time for questions. If you have any question, if you are a machine or if you are learning, you can do them. Yeah, okay.
Hi, quick question. I wanted to know if you know what's Sitecore's approach to generalized models that will be part of the product and things that we should be building ourselves, such as the tagging, the model for tagging has been added as part of the product. Are there more models coming through?
Yes, I mean, we're always investing in driving some of the value I've talked about here. I think I can share what's in 9.1 in terms of Cortex if you went to Jason's presentation. But in terms of what's coming, I can really say, stuff is coming, but we'll certainly share that when it's available to be released. Yep.
Any more questions? If not, thank you, Amanda. Thank you for being here.